Sarah Catherine Whitmore pressed her trembling fingers against the cold train window, watching the endless prairie stretch before her like an ocean of golden grass. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on steel tracks had been her only companion for 3 days, carrying her away from everything she'd ever known toward a future that terrified her more than the poverty she'd left behind in Boston. At 24, she had already been discarded by 2 prospective husbands who deemed her too plain, too quiet, too unremarkable for their grand ambitions. The advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper had been her last hope, a desperate gamble that led her to this moment, traveling to Cedar Falls, Wyoming, to marry a stranger named Thomas Harrington who needed a wife and mother for his young daughter. The letter in her worn leather satchel had been brief, almost clinical in its simplicity. Thomas Harrington, widower, age 32, owned a modest ranch outside Cedar Falls. He required a woman of good character to manage his household and care for his 6-year-old daughter, Emma. No mention of love, no promises of romance, just the practical arrangement that had become her only escape from a life of servitude in her aunt's boarding house. Sarah had responded with equal pragmatism, describing her skills in cooking, sewing, and child care while carefully omitting the cruel words that had followed her throughout her life. Unwanted, unremarkable, destined for spinsterhood. As the train pulled into Cedar Falls Station, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The platform buzzed with activity despite the late afternoon hour, cowboys and merchants conducting business, while families reunited with arriving passengers. She gathered her meager belongings, 2 worn carpetbags containing everything she owned, and stepped onto the wooden platform with legs unsteady from 3 days of travel. The air here tasted different, cleaner somehow, carrying the scent of sage and possibility that made her dare to hope this new beginning might offer something more than mere survival. A tall figure approached through the crowd, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the platform as he removed his hat in a gesture of respect. Thomas Harrington was not the weathered frontiersman she had imagined, but a man whose gentle eyes seemed to hold secrets deeper than the Wyoming sky. His dark hair showed threads of premature silver, and there was something in his careful manner that suggested he carried burdens heavier than the practical need for a wife. Beside him stood a small girl with enormous blue eyes and hair the color of wheat, who clung to her father's leg while studying Sarah with the intense curiosity of childhood. Thomas extended his hand in greeting, his voice warm but formal as he introduced himself and his daughter Emma. The little girl remained silent, her small fingers twisted in the fabric of her father's coat, as she continued her examination of the woman who had traveled so far to join their isolated world. Sarah knelt to Emma's level, offering a gentle smile that had comforted countless children during her years working in her aunt's boarding house. Something flickered in the child's eyes, a recognition perhaps, or maybe just the natural connection between 2 souls who understood what it meant to feel alone in the world. The ride to the Harrington Ranch passed in relative quiet, the wagon wheels creating their own rhythm across the rutted dirt road that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Thomas pointed out landmarks along the way, the distant mountains that marked the territory boundaries, the creek that provided water for the cattle, the grove of cottonwood trees where Emma liked to play when the weather permitted. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man unaccustomed to sharing personal information, yet Sarah sensed an underlying tension that had nothing to do with the awkwardness of their arranged meeting. Emma sat between them on the wagon seat, occasionally glancing up at Sarah with an expression that seemed far too serious for a 6-year-old child. There was something haunting in those blue eyes, a depth of understanding that spoke of experiences no child should possess. When Sarah attempted to engage her in conversation about her favorite games or the animals on the ranch, Emma responded with single-word answers delivered in a voice barely above a whisper. Thomas explained that his daughter had been unusually quiet since her mother's death 2 years earlier, but something in his tone suggested there were details he wasn't sharing. The Harrington Ranch appeared before them as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took Sarah's breath away. The house was larger than she had expected, a solid 2-story structure built from local timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, barns and storage sheds arranged with the practical efficiency of a working ranch. Everything spoke of prosperity and careful maintenance, Yet there was something indefinably melancholy about the place, as if happiness had once lived there but departed with reluctant steps. Thomas helped Sarah down from the wagon and carried her bags toward the house, his movements efficient but gentle. Emma ran ahead to open the front door, the first display of enthusiasm Sarah had witnessed from the child. The interior of the house revealed the same careful maintenance as the exterior, with furniture that spoke of comfort rather than luxury and windows that filled the rooms with golden light. Photographs lined the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace, but Sarah noticed they were all of Emma alone. No family portraits that might have included her deceased mother. As Thomas showed Sarah to her room, a pleasant space at the front of the house with a view of the approaching mountains, he explained the daily routines of ranch life and his expectations for their arrangement. She would manage the household, prepare meals, and care for Emma while he tended to the cattle and maintained the property. Their marriage ceremony would take place the following week, a simple affair at the local church that would formalize their union in the eyes of God and the community. His tone remained carefully neutral, but Sarah caught glimpses of something deeper in his expression, a pain that he kept carefully hidden behind the mask of practical necessity. That first evening passed quietly, with Sarah preparing supper from the well-stocked pantry while Thomas tended to the evening chores. Emma sat at the kitchen table, ostensibly working on her letters, but actually watching Sarah's every movement with the intensity of a small detective. The child's silence felt heavy in the warm kitchen, broken only by the sounds of cooking and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. When Sarah attempted to help Emma with her lessons, the little girl flinched away from her touch as if physical contact caused pain. During supper, Sarah learned more about the isolated nature of their new life together. The nearest neighbors lived 5 miles away, and trips to town were infrequent affairs reserved for necessary supplies and church services. Thomas spoke briefly about the challenges of ranch life, the unpredictable weather that could destroy a season's work, the constant vigilance required to protect the livestock from predators, both animal and human. His words painted a picture of a demanding but rewarding existence. Yet Sarah sensed there were dangers he wasn't discussing, threats that existed beyond the natural hardships of frontier life. After Emma was sent to bed, Sarah and Thomas sat in the parlor making awkward conversation about practical matters. The financial arrangements of their marriage, the division of household responsibilities, the legal documents that would need to be signed to formalize their union. Thomas proved to be a thoughtful man despite his reserved manner, asking about her preferences for managing the household and deferring to her experience with children when discussing Emma's care. Yet throughout their conversation, Sarah noticed his eyes frequently drifting to the windows, as if he expected to see something disturbing in the gathering darkness. Their first week together established a routine that felt surprisingly natural despite the artificial nature of their arrangement. Sarah rose before dawn to prepare breakfast and pack Thomas's lunch for his work on the range, while Emma slowly began to emerge from her shell of silence. The child showed Sarah her favorite hiding places around the ranch, the secret fort she had built behind the barn, the collection of interesting stones she kept in a wooden box beneath her bed. Gradually, Emma began to speak in full sentences, revealing a bright intelligence and a creativity that had been suppressed by whatever trauma had stolen her voice. Yet even as their days found a comfortable rhythm, Sarah began to notice disturbing undercurrents that Thomas seemed determined to ignore. Emma often woke screaming from nightmares she couldn't or wouldn't describe, terrible dreams that left her shaking and afraid to return to sleep. Thomas would comfort his daughter with practiced efficiency, but his explanations for her distress seemed rehearsed and unconvincing. He blamed her mother's death, the isolation of ranch life, the natural fears that plagued sensitive children, but Sarah's experience with traumatized youngsters told her there was more to Emma's suffering than simple grief. Strange incidents began to accumulate like storm clouds on the horizon. Small things that might have been dismissed individually but formed a pattern of increasing concern when viewed together. Sarah found Emma's bedroom window standing open on cold mornings despite being certain she had closed it the night before. Footprints appeared in the soft earth around the house, boot prints too large to belong to Thomas and positioned as if someone had been watching the windows under cover of darkness. The horses grew restless without apparent cause, whinnying and pawing the ground as if they sensed the presence of predators lurking just beyond the circle of ranch buildings. Thomas dismissed Sarah's concerns with explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface, but failed to address the growing sense of menace that seemed to surround their isolated homestead. The open windows were caused by shifting wood in the old house, he claimed, while the mysterious footprints belonged to drifting cowboys seeking temporary work. The horses were merely responding to the approaching change of seasons, their instincts telling them to prepare for winter's hardships. His calm demeanor never wavered, but Sarah noticed he had begun carrying his rifle more frequently and checking the locks on doors and windows with obsessive thoroughness. The truth began to emerge during their second week together, revealed not through Thomas's reluctant admissions but through Emma's gradual return to normal childhood behavior. As the little girl grew more comfortable with Sarah's presence, she began to share details about her life before their marriage that painted a disturbing picture of fear and constant vigilance. She spoke of being instructed never to play outside alone, of secret signals she was supposed to use if strangers approached the house, of hiding places her father had shown her in case of danger. These revelations suggested that Thomas's need for a wife went beyond household management and into the realm of protection and safety. Emma's breakthrough came on a quiet Tuesday morning when Sarah was teaching her to make biscuits, their hands working together in the flour-dusted bowl while sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. The child had been unusually animated, chattering about a story she had read and asking questions about Sarah's life before coming to Wyoming. Then, without warning, she looked up with those serious blue eyes and whispered the words that would change everything between them. "Can you be my mommy?" she asked, her small voice carrying a weight of longing that broke Sarah's heart into 1,000 pieces. The question hung in the air between them like a prayer waiting for an answer, and Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she knelt to embrace the child who had already claimed such a large piece of her heart. Emma melted into her arms with desperate intensity, clinging to her with the fierce grip of someone who had learned not to trust that good things would remain in her life. In that moment, Sarah realized that her own desperate need to be wanted had found its perfect match in a little girl's desperate need to be loved unconditionally. Whatever dangers threatened their fragile family, whatever secrets Thomas continued to hide, this connection with Emma made everything else worthwhile. That afternoon brought visitors to the ranch. 3 men on horseback who approached the house with the casual confidence of those who expected to be welcome. Thomas emerged from the barn with his rifle in hand, his entire demeanor transformed from gentle rancher to dangerous protector in the span of heartbeats. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as heated words were exchanged, the visitors gesturing aggressively while Thomas stood his ground with quiet determination. Emma pressed close to Sarah's side, her small body trembling with fear that seemed disproportionate to the scene unfolding in their yard. The confrontation ended when Thomas raised his rifle in clear warning, prompting the visitors to wheel their horses and disappear toward the eastern horizon. When he returned to the house, his face was grim with the weight of unspoken knowledge, and Sarah knew the time for half-truths and careful omissions had finally passed. That evening, after Emma had been tucked safely into bed, Thomas sat Sarah down in the parlor and began to reveal the story he had been hiding since her arrival. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he poured himself a measure of whiskey and began to speak of events that had shattered his world and continued to threaten everything he held dear. Martha Harrington had not died of illness as the community believed, Thomas revealed with painful honesty. She had been murdered by members of a criminal gang led by a man named Jake Morrison, killed because she had witnessed their robbery of the Cedar Falls Bank and could identify the perpetrators. Thomas had testified at Morrison's trial, his testimony helping to secure convictions that sent 3 men to prison for long terms. But Morrison himself had escaped custody during transport, disappearing into the lawless territories where wanted men could hide indefinitely while planning their revenge against those who had wronged them. The ranch had been under subtle siege ever since, Thomas explained, with Morrison's remaining associates conducting a campaign of psychological warfare designed to drive the Harrington family from their land or force Thomas to retract his testimony. Cattle had been stolen, fences cut, buildings damaged in ways that could be dismissed as accidents or natural misfortune. The message was clear: leave Wyoming or face consequences that would make Martha's death seem merciful by comparison. Thomas had refused to abandon the land his father had claimed, the home where Emma had been born, the place where Martha's memory lived in every room and every familiar vista. Sarah listened to this revelation with growing understanding of the courage it had taken for Thomas to bring another woman into such a dangerous situation. Her presence at the ranch served multiple purposes beyond the practical needs of household management and childcare. Morrison's gang would be less likely to attack a property where an innocent woman might be harmed, their twisted code of frontier honor providing some protection against the most violent forms of retaliation. Additionally, Sarah's background as a mail-order bride with no local connections meant she couldn't be used as leverage against Thomas through threats to her family or friends. The weight of this knowledge settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy cloak, transforming her understanding of everything that had occurred since her arrival. Thomas's careful vigilance, Emma's nightmares and fearful silences, the subtle wrongness that had pervaded even the most peaceful moments of their new life together, all of it now made terrible sense. She was not simply a wife and mother figure brought in to fill practical needs, but a potential target in a conflict that had already claimed one innocent life. The realization should have terrified her, should have sent her fleeing back to the relative safety of her aunt's boarding house in Boston, but instead it strengthened her resolve to protect the family that had already become precious to her. Over the following days, Sarah threw herself into the role of protector with the same determination she had once applied to mere survival. She learned to recognize the warning signs that indicated potential trouble, the subtle changes in animal behavior that suggested intruders in the area, the patterns of normal ranch activity that would help her identify when something was amiss. Thomas taught her to shoot his spare rifle, her natural steadiness and careful attention to detail making her a surprisingly accurate marksman despite her lack of experience with firearms. More importantly, she began to help Emma develop the confidence and awareness she would need to stay safe in their dangerous world. The child responded to Sarah's patient guidance with remarkable resilience, gradually learning to balance necessary caution with the natural curiosity and playfulness of childhood. Together they practiced the safety procedures Thomas had established, turning serious preparations into games that Emma could understand and remember. They created secret signals for different types of danger, established hiding places that only the three of them knew about, and developed contingency plans for various emergency scenarios. Through it all, Sarah marveled at Emma's courage and adaptability, qualities that would serve her well regardless of what the future might bring. Their wedding ceremony took place on a crisp October morning at the small church in Cedar Falls, attended by a handful of neighbors who had become genuine friends despite the circumstances that had brought Sarah to Wyoming. The service was simple but deeply meaningful, with Emma standing beside them as Thomas and Sarah exchanged vows that carried weight beyond the traditional promises of marriage. They were pledging not just to love and honor each other, but to face whatever dangers the future might hold as a united family. The ring Thomas placed on Sarah's finger had belonged to his grandmother, a tangible connection to the generations of strong women who had carved lives from the unforgiving frontier. The reception that followed was a modest affair held in the church social hall, with the local ladies contributing dishes that showcased the abundance of their harvest season. Sarah found herself genuinely welcomed into the community, not just as Thomas's new wife, but as an individual whose quiet strength and obvious devotion to Emma had already earned respect and admiration. For a few hours, surrounded by laughter and celebration, it was easy to forget the shadows that lurked at the edges of their happiness and simply enjoy the warmth of belonging somewhere for the first time in her adult life. But Morrison's gang had not forgotten the Harringtons, and their patience was finally reaching its end. The wedding celebration was interrupted by the arrival of a stranger who claimed to be a traveling preacher seeking shelter for the night. Something in his manner set off warning bells for Thomas, who politely but firmly declined the man's request while quietly alerting the other men present to potential danger. The stranger departed without argument, but not before his cold eyes had catalogued every detail of the gathering, memorizing faces and noting the layout of the church and surrounding buildings. That night, as Sarah and Thomas settled into their married life, Emma's screaming awakened them from deep sleep. The child was sitting bolt upright in bed, pointing toward her window with terror-stricken eyes as she babbled about the shadow man who had been watching her from outside. Thomas immediately grabbed his rifle and went to investigate while Sarah comforted Emma, but found no evidence of an intruder in the churned mud beneath the child's window. Yet Sarah noticed that Emma's description of the shadow man matched the appearance of the false preacher who had appeared at their wedding reception. The psychological pressure intensified over the following weeks, with subtle signs of surveillance and intimidation designed to wear down their resistance without providing grounds for involving the local sheriff. Thomas found his cattle scattered across miles of range, requiring days of hard work to round them up again. Sarah discovered that someone had been in the house during their absence, moving small objects and leaving barely perceptible signs of their presence. Emma's nightmares returned with renewed intensity, her sleep disrupted by visions of faceless men who whispered threats in voices that seemed to echo from beyond the grave. The crisis finally came to a head on a cold November evening when Emma disappeared during the brief time between supper and bedtime. Sarah had been washing dishes while Thomas tended to the evening chores, and Emma had been playing quietly in the parlor with her collection of dolls. When Sarah went to call her for her bath, the child was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never existed. The front door stood slightly ajar despite the cold wind, and muddy footprints led from the porch into the gathering darkness beyond the circle of lamplight. Thomas organized a search party from among their neighbors, men who had faced Indian raids and natural disasters but whose faces showed the special horror reserved for crimes against children. They spread out across the range with lanterns and torches, calling Emma's name into the howling wind while Sarah waited at the house in case the child found her way home independently. Hours passed without any sign of Emma or her captors, and Sarah found herself bargaining with a god she had never fully trusted, offering her own life in exchange for the safety of the little girl who had taught her what it meant to love unconditionally. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when Emma herself managed to escape from her captors during a moment of inattention. She appeared at the kitchen door just after midnight, exhausted and terrified but essentially unharmed, with a story that revealed the true scope of Morrison's revenge. The men who had taken her were not the crude outlaws Sarah had imagined, but professional criminals who had planned their operation with military precision. They had held Emma in an abandoned line shack about 3 miles from the ranch, intending to use her as leverage to force Thomas to publicly recant his testimony and admit to lying at Morrison's trial. Emma's escape had been possible only because one of her captors had underestimated the resourcefulness of a frightened 6-year-old who had been taught to think strategically about her own safety. She had waited until her guards were distracted by their card game, then slipped her small hands from the ropes that bound her and crept away into the darkness. Her knowledge of the ranch's terrain, gained through months of exploring with Sarah's encouragement, had enabled her to find her way home despite the disorienting effects of fear and exhaustion. The child's courage in the face of mortal danger left Sarah both proud and heartbroken, amazed by Emma's resilience while grieving for the innocence that had been forever lost. The failed kidnapping marked a turning point in Morrison's campaign against the Harrington family, escalating from psychological intimidation to direct violence that could no longer be ignored by local authorities. Sheriff Williams arrived at the ranch before dawn with a posse of deputies, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were dealing with men who had crossed the line from criminal mischief into acts that demanded swift and decisive justice. Thomas provided detailed descriptions of the threatening incidents that had plagued his family, while Emma bravely recounted her ordeal in a clear voice that belied her tender years. The search for Morrison's gang led the posse to the abandoned line shack where Emma had been held, finding evidence of their presence but no sign of the criminals themselves. They had vanished into the Badlands that stretched eastward toward the territorial border, taking advantage of terrain that provided countless hiding places for those who knew how to use it effectively. Sheriff Williams promised to send word to neighboring jurisdictions and territorial authorities, but admitted privately to Thomas that Morrison was likely beyond their reach, unless he made the mistake of returning to Wyoming for another attempt at revenge. In the weeks that followed Emma's rescue, life at the ranch began to assume a new normalcy built on the foundation of shared trauma and mutual dependence. The 3 members of their small family had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for the experience, bound together by bonds that went beyond legal marriage or adoption papers. Sarah no longer questioned whether she truly belonged in their isolated world, while Thomas had learned to trust completely in her courage and commitment to their family's welfare. Emma, though still occasionally troubled by nightmares, displayed a confidence and maturity that spoke of her complete faith in the adults who had proven themselves worthy of her love. Christmas arrived with a blanket of snow that transformed the harsh landscape into something approaching fairyland, and Sarah threw herself into creating the kind of celebration that Emma had never experienced during the years of fear and constant vigilance. They cut a tree from the grove of pine trees near the creek, decorating it with handmade ornaments and candles that filled the parlor with warm, flickering light. Sarah spent evenings after Emma's bedtime sewing a new dress for the child's favorite doll, while Thomas carved a set of wooden animals that would populate the miniature farm Emma had requested from Santa Claus. The holiday season passed peacefully, with no signs of Morrison or his associates disturbing their newfound tranquility. Thomas began to speak cautiously of the future, making plans for expanding the cattle herd and possibly building additional rooms onto the house if their family continued to grow. Sarah found herself daring to hope that their troubles were truly behind them, that Morrison had finally accepted defeat and moved on to easier targets in other territories. Emma's nightmares became less frequent, replaced by dreams of spring adventures and the new foal that was expected from Thomas's prize mare. But Morrison had not abandoned his quest for revenge, merely changed his strategy from direct confrontation to patient stalking that would allow him to strike when his enemies least expected it. He had spent the winter months in a hideout across the territorial border, gathering information about the Harrington family's routines and weaknesses, while assembling a new group of followers willing to participate in his final act of vengeance. This time there would be no kidnapping attempts or psychological warfare, just swift and deadly violence that would eliminate Thomas Harrington and anyone else who had dared to stand against him. The attack came on a warm spring evening when Sarah and Emma were working in the kitchen garden they had planted together, their hands dirty with honest soil as they tended the vegetables that would feed their family through the coming winter. Thomas was in the barn checking on his mare, who had been showing signs that her foal might arrive within the next few days. The peaceful domesticity of the scene made it seem impossible that danger could intrude upon their carefully constructed world. Yet Morrison and two companions were already moving into position around the ranch buildings with weapons drawn and murder in their hearts. Emma's sharp eyes spotted the approaching threat first, her experience with danger allowing her to recognize the wrongness in the way the three men moved across their land. She grabbed Sarah's hand and pointed toward the barn, where Thomas had emerged with his rifle in response to some sound or instinct that had warned him of impending trouble. For a moment, the tableau held like a painting frozen in time. The setting sun painting everything in golden light, the familiar landscape of home and safety, and the dark figures that represented everything they had fought to overcome. The battle was brief but intense, with Thomas's military experience and intimate knowledge of his own land giving him advantages that offset Morrison's superior numbers. Sarah proved herself a capable ally, using the rifle Thomas had taught her to shoot with deadly accuracy that surprised even her. Emma followed their emergency procedures perfectly, hiding in the root cellar they had prepared for just such a crisis while the adults fought to protect everything they held dear. When the gunfire finally stopped, Morrison lay dead in the ranch yard while his surviving companion had fled into the darkness, never to return. In the aftermath of violence, as they waited for Sheriff Williams to arrive and officially close the chapter on their long ordeal, Sarah held Emma close while Thomas dealt with the practical aftermath of their victory. The child who had asked if Sarah could be her mommy had found not just a mother but a protector who would kill to defend her if necessary. The mail-order bride who had thought no one wanted her had discovered that she possessed courage and strength she never knew existed. Their family, forged in conflict and tempered by shared danger, had finally found the peace that would allow them to build the future they all deserved. As spring gave way to summer and the ranch flourished under their combined efforts, Sarah often reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of belonging. She had traveled west expecting nothing more than survival and respectability, but had found instead a love deeper than anything she had imagined possible. Emma's simple question had transformed not just their relationship but Sarah's entire understanding of her own worth and purpose. In learning to be wanted, she had discovered that she was not just capable of love but worthy of it, a realization that would sustain her through whatever challenges the future might hold in their beautiful, dangerous corner of the Wyoming Territory.